Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Anu Basu, and I'm a professor at San Jose State and director of the Silicon Valley Center for Entrepreneurship. And we host our speaker sessions in collaboration with the IDEAS Club of San Jose State. So we have Sierra, who's the president of the club, and Varenia, who's also officer of the club and is responsible for the Zin Starter program, and both of them are with us this afternoon. So welcome to this session. And the purpose of these events is to inform and inspire our student entrepreneurs. And so that, if you have any questions, you're thinking about entrepreneurship, this is your chance to ask questions. Some of you may be taking classes, but, we have guests to come and give us a wider, broader perspective. And so it's in that spirit that today we have a young entrepreneur here, Sanchali Pal, and she is the founder and CEO of Joro. I downloaded the app, by the way. And so let me just give you a brief background about Sanchali. She founded Joro to empower people to take climate action that matters. And prior to Joro, she worked in sustainable development in Africa and South Asia, and where she saw the devastating effects of climate crisis for populations. And she also worked at Tesla, so she has an interest in sort of climate, and that's obviously why and taking climate action, and that's why she started Joro, but we'll ask her more about that. And she holds a bachelor's degree from Princeton in economics and an MBA from Harvard Business School. So we're really happy and delighted, Sanchali, that you could join us this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
So I have a few questions for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And so the students and the audience can ask questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A so that we can look at them. And Sierra is here. She'll be monitoring the Q&A and asking questions. So please do that. Okay, can you see the Q&A button there? Right. So let's get started then. And so, Sanchali, how early did you start? What was your first entrepreneurial experience? When did you first get interested in entrepreneurship?
I think my mother would say that my first entrepreneurial experience was my lemonade stands when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. Probably around when I was 7 years old. I got really into lemonade stands and bake sales and making and selling things on the street. I have to say, I didn't have the best marketing skills. Sometimes I set up my tent in the backyard, so I didn't get a lot of customers. But those were my first sort of experiences. And then really, I think the time when I took this upon myself first was in high school. I started a nonprofit club at school. I lived in the Boston area, but I visited India every year to visit family. And I had discovered some information while I was there that a lot of people didn't have access to clean water and energy, and it really disturbed me. So I came back and spent some time researching and working with some professors in the Boston area to learn more about water and sanitation and energy access in the developing world, and ended up starting a club and nonprofit at my high school to raise money for folks in Latin America and in India, with a friend of mine who was from Latin America, to provide more access to clean water and solar energy. Actually, it was also my first exposure to like sustainability related things. So that experience of raising money, setting up a new initiative that was a nonprofit, and then gathering support for it was a real entrepreneurial experience. I think it gave me practice building something from 0 to 1. And then I had an experience in college of working on a social enterprise that also helped me have that experience.
Mm-hmm. And so that's wonderful. See, so it seems you've always had an interest in sort of, climate and sort of doing good. And, and so did you, were either of these, it sounds like in high school, this was something that you took up and, you did on your own. What about college? Was it part of any class that you took at Princeton, or was it again something outside of your, regular class activities?
Yes, it was for a class. We took a course called something like Innovation for Social Impact. It was an elective offered, and it was with a professor who was visiting from another school. So it was actually quite a different class. It was a very practical class in which we had to create a business model for a new social impact venture, build a team. I did so with 3 of my classmates, one of whom was your son, Nikhil. So we started an idea called My Card, My Story, in which we would sell artwork created by underprivileged students in India and Bombay specifically, sell that artwork and cycle the proceeds back to fund vocational art training programs for those students so they could have careers in the arts. And so that was both, it started as a class, we made the business plan for a class, but then we continued it out of our own interest after the class finished.
Yeah, I remember you actually made the cards, and I think we still have some cards upstairs. You made cards and then you, sold them. Is that right? And you went to India and you got children to make to make the designs and make pictures that you made into cards. Isn't that right?
Yeah, we made physical cards. We actually sold thousands of cards. And then we ended up also creating an e-card product that was quite similar to a paperless post card that had an animation that would take it out of the card, and it featured a video from the child and a note from the child that you were supporting with the purchase. And we actually had a couple enterprise sales. So we sold those to a couple organizations for their holiday cards. But then all of us graduated and got jobs, so we didn't have a chance to complete it. We did give all of our work back to a nonprofit that we worked with in Bombay who still uses some of it.
Wonderful, yeah. So that's great. So in fact, there are some my students on this, in this webinar as well, who are taking a class like that called Venture Lab, where they're supposed to come up with an idea and take it to the next level. So I do remember your customer interviews and so on that you did for this project.
I think it was great practice. I really learned a lot from that experience. Everything from learning how to register a legal entity, how to manage team dynamics, especially when you're working in a team of peers and there's no formal authority or no one forcing you to do anything. And then learning about customer interviews and using that to shape product. I think those were all really helpful experiences.
Okay, so moving on, what about Joro? Tell us about Joro. How did you come up with the idea for Joro, and and what's the overall vision for Joro?
So I started Joro just a couple years ago, but the idea for me was incubated in my final year in college. When I saw the documentary Food Inc. when I was a senior in college, and I was also happened to be the manager of a dining hall. And when that was happening, I saw the movie. It made me think, oh, I am part of systems. My consumption is part of systems, and aggregate demand forms the types of suppliers or companies that are serving us. If I think about my unit of impact, which is my dining hall, and I have this ability to work with the cooks and decide how much food we're ordering every month, how much of a difference could we make if we had a few more vegetarians, for instance? What's the environmental impact we could have? And so we did that math with the chef, and we realized that if there were only 5 more people who said they were vegetarian, the dining hall would change its ordering habits to introduce 1 more vegetarian dish per day. And if we add that up over the course of a year, that was a really significant impact. That was like taking hundreds of cars off the road every year from a climate impact. So we did that. And that, after I had that experience, I ended up taking a course in carbon footprinting. And my final project was to build a carbon model for myself, which I ended up using to make several decisions on how I wanted to live my life. So I decided I was cutting down my meat consumption from 12 meals a week to 2 meals a week. I decided I was going to take cars less. When I could walk or bike, I was going to walk or bike. And when I became a management consultant after I graduated from college, I developed a flight budget for myself. So it was both dollars and carbon as a flight budget. And through those actions over the course of several years while I was working, I ended up reducing my carbon footprint by about 30%. When I went to business school, I wanted to focus on climate change, as you mentioned in the bio. I saw a lot of the effects of the climate crisis firsthand when I was living in India and Ethiopia, working in consulting. And I came back to go to business school to find opportunities to scale up underfunded opportunities for people to take climate action. And I realized that this action I had been taking in my life, if I did that with a lot of other people, we'd have a huge impact. In fact, if, say, everyone in the United States was able to reduce their carbon footprint by 50%, we would have the equivalent impact of taking all of the cars off the road and shutting down all the coal plants. So it's a pretty significant thing if we could all do it together. So what if we had a tool to make that easier? And I kept looking and there was no tool available that I could find nothing better than the spreadsheet I'd made for myself. So that was really where the idea for Joro was born. And after I graduated from business school, I spent some time researching at Harvard where I was and at MIT where there was a lot of research on carbon footprint analysis and climate change, and was able to develop the first version of this tool that uses credit and debit card data as an automatic data feed to see the emissions in your life. So now we have an app that you can connect your credit and debit cards. You can see the carbon emissions behind every purchase. That's our proprietary technology that does that. And then you can take action on it. You can either get guides and recommendations to lower your emissions, or you can also choose to offset your emissions by paying for climate projects around the world to reduce emissions if you can't. And that is now what's live in the App Store.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So did you do this, did you start on your own, or did you have you had a co-founder at the start, right?
I did. I actually had two co-founders initially. Right when I was exiting grad school, we had worked on this idea as a research project I mentioned I was working with some folks at MIT. And when I graduated, I was the only one who could work on it full time. The others were still in academic programs. And so we decided that I and one other person would be co-founders. The third person decided to go get a full-time job. And then the other person I was working with was a PhD candidate in this exact field. She was a software developer working on mobile carbon footprinting. How can we use especially location data to understand people's carbon footprints? And we worked together for about a year. But over the course of that year, she wasn't able to stop her PhD. She still was working on it. She actually was hoping to get good results and got bad results from her experiment. So she had to spend another year on her PhD unexpectedly. And I continued to work on Joro with this financial data path. So by the end of the first year, I had really been the one working on it. She was more in an advisory role. And after a year, we decided to formalize that. So she left the company officially. She gave back all of her shares, and I became the sole founder officially. And so I've been the solo founder of the company. And really, I think that's when the company started in earnest, was like 1 year after I left business school. Once we'd sort of decided on the core product, we'd made this decision with my co-founder that it was just going to be me. And we raised our first round of funding that summer. So that was when I moved to the Bay Area from Boston and really started the company.
Right. So I want to ask you, of course, about funding, because the topic is securing funding. But just before that, how did you build the first app, the MVP? Did you build it, or did your co-founder, or did you ask someone else? So how did you go about doing that?
This was one of the really hard parts of my co-founder stepping back, because she was a software developer and I was not. I had never even worked at a software company before. So I had a lot of learning to do. I benefited a lot from her advice and also from one of the other people in her lab's advice. So they both became advisors to me and helped me understand how to build the core architecture of the product and of the algorithms. And they helped me I interviewed and hired contract developers to work on building the product. Luckily, we found someone who was my classmate from business school's brother, who was an excellent freelance developer and was looking to create his own independent contractor shop. So we were his first project. And I got very lucky because he was a very savvy and experienced sort of product developer. So I worked closely with him to build the MVP of the first product with some advice from my former co-founder. We won some money from MIT and Harvard business plan competitions. So we had about $30,000 in grant funding, which I used to build the MVP. We hired my friend's brother and his team for, I believe it was like 3 2-week sprints to build the MVP. And I went and did all the user research. I did the wireframes, and I also did the basic designs. And then the developer cleaned up those designs and built them, and we sort of went back and forth. So after first we did 2 sprints, and we went and tested it with a bunch of users. We built basically a test flight app, and tested it with about 30 users, got some feedback, figured out another round of iterations, built for another 2 weeks, and then had about 50 users, got a couple months of data with those 50 users, and then I went out to raise funding.
That's what my question was. At what stage did you start raising external funding? So initially you put in your own money. I guess you were bootstrapping initially, or?
Initially we're bootstrapping. So that first year was really tough when I didn't know exactly what we were going to build yet. I decided to take a research position part-time at Harvard so that I could pay the bills. So my partner was actually in graduate school at the time, so we had no income. So I took this 20-hour-a-week research position to pay for rent and groceries, and then did this research on my own, a lot of user research. Basically, I talked to about 100 users in those first few months and started to figure out the idea of what the MVP would look like. We used the grant money we got only to hire contractors and to pay some legal fees to solidify the structure of the company. And then by 8 months later, we had this sort of working MVP. And I actually went out to raise funding before that and failed. So I went out to raise funding before we had an MVP, and I had a pitch deck and I had an idea, and I went to go talk to about 10 investors. I scheduled about 10 meetings, and everyone said no.
So these were angels, or they were VCs, or who did you go to?
They were a mix. I went to primarily clean tech investors, impact investors, and some angels. And I scrounged together these contacts through different places. I didn't have any contacts really in the space before, so I tracked down people through friends and contacts. I scheduled these 10 meetings. Everyone said no, except for one person said maybe. But the person who said maybe said, you got to go get some data with an MVP first. So I was like, okay, I have these wireframes, I just haven't built it yet. I'm just going to go build it, and we're going to spend a few more months figuring this out. So then we did that. We got a few months of data. And then I went back to that same investor, and I went to my professor also, who I had been doing research for, who is a professor of entrepreneurship. And both of us gave me my first 2 angel checks, which were $25,000 each. So it wasn't like a huge amount of money, but it was enough to keep building and to start to pay myself a little bit just to cover expenses, so I could start working on it full time. And then after that, I went and scheduled 2 weeks of meetings. I actually got a final interview at Y Combinator and a final interview with Techstars. And then I scheduled 2 weeks of pitch meetings in California. So I went out to the Bay Area and did 2 weeks of meetings. We didn't end up getting Y Combinator. That's a whole nother story. We got Techstars, and we filled up 500K in funding. And the last call ended up making it $1 million.
Fantastic. Yeah. So what did you find? Why did the first lot of those who said no? I mean, that must have been demoralizing, right? But did they explain why they said no? Did they explain that they wanted the MVP, or they wanted some more evidence, or did they say anything?
Yeah. That first group of saying no was very demoralizing and difficult for me, especially because I didn't think that it was responsible for me to continue working on the company without any means of financial support. So I had set this internal goal for myself that if I didn't raise funding in a few months, I would stop working on the idea and I'd go get a job. So because I didn't meet that deadline, it was especially difficult to continue to work on it. But I did learn a few things. I think first, the most useful feedback I got was from this one investor and a couple other ones who said, if you have a little bit more traction, maybe. So go prove to me you can make this work. So that was really helpful. I also got some pieces of feedback that I myself just needed to learn how to pitch better. And I actually had one investor who passed, but gave me 3 sessions of coaching on how to pitch better. That really helped. I learned I needed to speak louder. I had needed to be more confident. I needed to paint a larger picture of the market because I was being very conservative with my estimates. I was being very bottom up instead of top down with estimating the market size. So I got a bunch of very tactical pieces of feedback that also, I think, especially like maybe women or people of color or people who are not used to pitching might find it hard to do those things when you have to make it sound like you're building something really big, but really you have no idea. And then I got some feedback that was it took me a long time to figure it out, but I'm glad I figured out I shouldn't listen to it, because it mostly meant that I was talking to the wrong investors.
Mhm.
And that feedback was people who wanted me to change my idea or change my business model.
Mhm.
And then they would invest in me. So I got a lot of investors say to me, if you can build a B2B model, then I'm interested. But that was very different. My model was B2C. And I spent a long time thinking about how can I change my pitch so it's B2B. But I realized actually after a few months that that's not the right thing to do. I had conviction in my approach and I had evidence for the market that I was trying to reach. And I just needed to find the right investors. And that was most validated by my conversation with Sequoia, which ended up investing. But I had reached out to them cold. And that experience, I think, was a good example of like, you might just be talking to the wrong investors, because if you talk to investors who are used to investing in business to business models, they're going to tell you to be a business to business company.
Yeah, so you raised some really interesting points. One is, of course, why, as we all know, that women and people of color find it much harder to get funding. I mean, that's what the statistics show, that they get a relatively much smaller proportion of funding than people in general. And so that seems to be really good advice. And then the other that you said about the larger picture, like what is the total addressable market, and paint the biggest picture to show what the potential of the business is. And that's something that can be hard to do, like you say, right at the beginning. You don't know who's going to really use your product. So and then the third is also really important, to know when to pivot, when to change, and when to stick to what is your own convictions. And obviously you know more about the space than anyone else, so having the courage of your own convictions is also really important. And then finally, making sure that you're doing your due diligence, making sure you're speaking to the right people. So yeah, and all those
I was going to say on that last point, I thought I was doing my due diligence by approaching energy investors and impact investors. But I think something I learned is that sector might not be as critical as business model. And that I should also have paid more attention to B2B versus B2C investors. Ultimately, my investors are almost all straight up technology investors. They actually don't have much to do with climate or with impact, but they saw the opportunity I was solving and they understood the risk profile of the solution I was proposing. And so that, I think I underestimated how important business model is to investors and to their ability to say yes.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So tell us a little bit about your cold calling, reaching out to, was it Brian Schreier? Was it the
Yes.
instant connection, or what do you do? Do you have any tips for our students? And some of my students who I believe are here have to reach out to an entrepreneur for an entrepreneur interview. And I was suggesting, well, you can reach anybody if you want to, whether it's, Steve Wozniak or whoever you want to, the Zoom founder or whoever. But do you have any tips for like cold calling, reaching out to people,
Yes,
in this case investors?
I do.
Or, yeah.
I think there's a couple strategies that worked for me, and I did this a few times, not just with Brian, but also I ended up reaching the founders of Fitbit and Headspace. And I took similar approaches with them. I did two things. One, I found evidence that they were interested in what I was building. So with Brian, I had subscribed to the Sequoia newsletter, and I saw a newsletter interview with him one week in which they asked him, what areas do you think there's not enough funding in? And he said, I think climate is the next big thing. And consumers, especially, there's no ways for consumers to get involved. So I read that and I realized, oh, he's thinking about this space too. So if I talk to him about my idea, he's already going to have been thinking about it. And I actually didn't approach him for funding. I truly approached him for advice. In some cases, I tried to approach for advice and I still only got advice. But in this case, I approached him for advice, especially because I was so early stage, I hadn't even raised money yet. I thought Sequoia would be way too big an investor, but I saw that he was a savvy investor who knew what it took to build something big. And he already was thinking about the problem I was solving. And he already was bought in. I didn't have to sell him on the problem. So that was the first thing, is I actually quoted his own interview back to him in my email. I said, I saw you said this. This is what I'm doing. will you talk to me about it, basically.
Yeah. But how can he
Um,
say no? He couldn't have said no.
and then it's definitely like the second thing is finding any points of connection that you can. So I did notice that he was a Princeton alum. I looked him up. I found out that we had this connection. And I knew that I could find his email online, but I thought it would be better if someone introduced us. So I went and searched in my LinkedIn contacts, and I found that another investor I had pitched, but who had passed, was connected to him on LinkedIn. So I went back to that investor who had passed and I said, hey, I'm trying to get in touch with Brian. I saw he said this in his newsletter. I think he's looking for someone like me. Would you mind introducing us? And so it was basically a cold intro because I had only talked to this other person once and they had said no to me. But he was willing to make the introduction because he saw how relevant it was. So I think that's the other thing is like, if wherever possible, there's this whole thing about getting warm intros. They don't have to be super warm. They can be lukewarm or like kind of tepid intros. They can just be someone who can act as that bridge between you and them. And even if you can't find that person, I know, for instance, Brian does take cold emails pretty frequently. Some people will just check those emails. And as long as you've written something relevant to them, they know as I think in all of those cases, I made it very clear that they were the kind of person who could help me. And same with the Headspace founder. I wrote to him saying, I'm doing something like Headspace, but in climate. And these are the reasons why I think it's similar. And these are things I want to learn from you. And I just want to get your advice. And so I engaged them in all of these cases, I engaged them first in a content discussion. I didn't ask them for money the first time we talked, except for at the end of the conversation. I said, by the way, I would love to formalize this ability to ask you for advice. Are you interested in investing? Because I'd like to keep calling you. And that was how those investments happened.
Fantastic. That's great. So how much, can I ask, how much have you raised so far?
So far, we've raised $3.5 million.
Fantastic. Yeah. Congratulations.
Thanks.
And so in retrospect, is there anything you wish, you had known, or any skills you could have learned at, that would have been useful to you that you could have learned maybe at university before you started Joro?
Definitely. A few that come to mind are, one, I wish I had spent more time paying attention to really early stage founding documentation, what's required. So with my original co-founders, we had to incorporate the company because we won this business plan competition at school and we couldn't accept the money unless we incorporated. So we incorporated.
By the way, yeah, sorry, you've given me an idea for our business plan competition, but yeah, go on.
Yeah. So we had to incorporate to accept the money, and there were 3 of us at the time, but none of us knew if we were going to work on the company full time because we were all still at school. So we had to put ourselves as the 3 directors of the board, and we issued shares equally among the 3 of us. But we didn't sign our document. We actually had documents in place for vesting, but we didn't sign them. You have to sign those documents within 30 days. Otherwise, they're voided. And I didn't realize that. We were gone for summer break, so we didn't sign those documents. And then the next year, when it actually became relevant, we were thinking about if we were going to leave our jobs and not get a job and start the company. We were all equal owners of the company in name. And so even the folks who were leaving, then we had to negotiate how much they would give back. So I wish I had signed those vesting documents. We figured it out in the end. It wasn't really a huge deal, but if I had been dealing with people who were less reasonable, I think it would have been challenging. I also think if I was starting something in school and I knew none of us were going to be working on it full time, I would have made the cliff longer. So usually normal vesting happens with a 1-year cliff. So people don't start vesting their shares for the first year. But if you're in school and it might be more than, you're not even starting work on the company today, I would have increased the cliff by the amount of time that we're not working on the company. So those are some like tactical things, but I wish I had spent some more time learning about those early stage founding docs. And also I'm really glad I learned about an 83B election and when I should sign that when I'm incorporating the company. So the differences between a C Corp and an S Corp, some of those like really basic things, it's good to be literate in before you have to make the decisions. And one really good book on that is Venture Deals, if you're not already covering that in your classes. But
Venture Deals, okay.
By Brad Feld.
Brad Feld, yeah.
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 It's a pretty dense, but the first few chapters are worth reading for anyone starting a company, I think. So those are some of the things, like tactical things I wish I'd known. I think also it's helpful if you're, it's helpful to go look at and understand different approaches for user feedback and user research. So spending some time learning about user research, whether that's through like a sprint approach or through like the lean startup methodology or whatever ways you might think about going to like gather user feedback and incorporating it in early product iterations, I think that could be helpful.
Sprint? What do you mean by the sprint approach?
So I actually found out of all of these different approaches I was encountered, the Google Sprint approach was the most useful to me. It's a book by Jake Knapp. I actually have it here. So Sprint by Jake Knapp, it was a 1 week, like 5-day sprint approach that they developed at Google Ventures to be able to test any idea in 5 days. And it really pushes you to try something out before you build anything. And I found that to be really helpful in the early days when we were still trying to figure out what the product was going to look like, to take this 5-day approach where you build it on paper and you go test it with users, or you build some experiential prototype of what you're building. And then it helps you understand if you need to go code, even, you know, 1 line of code or not. So I think it's also a quick read, and I keep it here every day because I use it still regularly.
That's very good to know. I can't write right now, but I made a mental note.
I'll send it to you. Yeah.
So we have, before I close with my final questions, we have some questions from the audience. And one of the ones I see is, how much of the company have you had to give away to investors and others?
Yes. So early advisors, both like combination of co-founders and other advisors that actually helped me in the early days when I didn't have anyone on board, I would say was like a few percentage points. So between 1% and 3% maybe was given away to early advisors. I also, in our seed and pre-seed funding, we raised our pre-seed funding on a safe note. So we gave a promise of future equity instead of raising equity because we were so early stage. And then we raised our seed was equity. So all of that those first investors converted at the seed. So all of our first $3.5 million we raised diluted the company between probably like around 25%, maybe a bit more. I think probably a bit more, maybe 25+%. And then our employees now, we have an employee pool. And so employees own about 10 to 15% of the company.
How many employees do you have now?
Now we have 9 full-time and we have a couple part-time.
Fantastic. And are they all based here or?
We have 6 people based in the Bay Area and 3 people based in other parts of the US. We started hiring remotely when the pandemic hit, and I think we'll continue to, at least across the US.
Great. Sierra, did you want to read some of the other questions? Oh.
Yes. Thank you, Sanchali, for the fantastic Q&A session with Dr. Basu. Now I'm going to read some questions from the audience. The first question is from Lucy. The classes that you took, did you take them in high school or are those in college?
The classes I took were in college. Those were both, I took the carbon footprint class in college. I took actually also a course on sustainable development that also helped inform what I was going to be doing. And then I took that course on social impact entrepreneurship. And in graduate school, I took more courses related to entrepreneurship and to climate, including a course on entrepreneurial finance, which was very helpful.
The next question is from Max. Did you have concerns about security from customers when it came to storing and collecting user information?
Privacy and security are definitely more important today than ever before. And we see that with big companies as well as small companies. And asking users for financial data can often be a sensitive piece of information. So it is something we think about very carefully. Luckily, in the fintech space, there are now sort of third-party tools that make it very secure to be able to connect with users' financial transaction data. Specifically, we use an API called Plaid, Plaid, which is sort of the backbone of a lot of the fintech apps in the US. It's used by Venmo, Robinhood, most of the big apps you can think of. So by working with them, we can get bank level security even as a small startup. So we've been able to incorporate that sort of bank level security and encryption since day one. And we are very careful to make sure our users know that we don't ever sell data, or that's not our business model. We make money when people purchase offsets through us. So we don't sell users data and we don't share it with third parties.
Thank you. A question from Jared. How did you decide on the % of ownership for each founder or added team member?
That is all a bit of an art, and a lot of it is benchmarking from other founders and investors. So once we had that's one of the benefits, I think, of having an institutional investor like Sequoia, is that because they've invested in so many companies, they're able to provide us some benchmarks on what's average for a company of our stage. So we were able to go back to advisors and employees and say, we're justifying this amount of equity because this is the average for a company of our size. But there is actually, I think the messiest and most difficult part of figuring out equity is founding teams. That's when maybe you're not sure if everyone's contributing equally, what roles people are taking, what responsibilities they'll have. And we actually wrote a business school case on that problem, using Joro as a case study for this sort of tricky founder situation when you don't know who's committed and people might leave. So there is a case at Harvard Business School that you can find online called, I think it's called Loop, because that was the original name of Joro. And it's about how do you think about splitting equity among founders. And I think the biggest takeaway from that case is that often people founding companies overestimate the contributions of early employees and early founders and give them too much equity. It's important to recognize that most of the company building in a successful company happens over many, many years. Company might be alive for 10 years if you're successful. So the first few months are often overweighted. And so we made sure, even though we were 3 founders initially, we split equity equally. When they left, one founder decided to give all of her shares back. The other founder got 2%. And they sound like really small numbers, but now, 3 years later, it feels like more than enough.
And when you say giving the percentage back to the company, what does that exactly mean?
So let's see, in a company, usually when you incorporate a company, you'll define a number of shares. The most common number of shares for a new company is 10 million. I don't know why, it's kind of an arbitrary number, but it gives you enough that you can distribute them over the course of the company. So when those 10 million shares are issued, a certain percentage are issued to people, like to a founder. A certain percentage might be issued to an option pool, which will be given to future employees. And then some might stay with the company if they're not issued, or even shares that aren't claimed by employees or never given out to employees would be owned by the company, and they'd go back into that original 10 million pool. So that's what I mean by giving it back to the company. These were shares that were issued to my co-founder, and she decided to issue them back to the company, at which point the company entity gets to decide, in this case me, because I'm the board of directors, decides how those play out, if they stay with the company, or in my case, I issued them to the option pool for future employees.
Yeah, thank you. And since Joro is mostly an app-based company, how long did it take you to create the app? And what is the process? And do you need to know coding?
We're still working on it. So I think it's constant iteration. The first version of the app, like I said, took about 6 weeks to build a working prototype that we felt was usable by customers to get some value out of it. And that probably depends on the complexity of the technology. In our case, we built the simplest possible version we could think of in about 6 weeks. It took us about, I would say, a year to have our carbon estimation algorithms be accurate enough that we felt comfortable charging people dollars to offset their emissions based on those estimates. So because we were building a relatively complicated technology on the calculation side, that took us about a year to build out something we felt really confident launching publicly. And then we're still, 2 years out after the first MVP, still iterating on all parts of the product. And definitely, I know that there are no code tools now that are pretty good for app building. I've seen a couple, especially in the last year, come out. But I do think for building an app, right now we build on a web-based tool called React Native that applies on both iOS and Android. You can also just build for iOS or just build for Android, but it does require some coding to be able to build it.
Yeah, one of the questions that is pretty similar to that is, what are the challenges of a non-technical founder, and how do you overcome those challenges?
There's both challenges and benefits to being a non-technical founder. I think I underestimated some of the benefits. There's a lot of stuff that now in retrospect, I realize I knew how to do, but at the time I really thought that I didn't know anything. But now I recognize that I was able to understand a lot of these concepts around entrepreneurial finance and the structure of the company early on, which was helpful because I was able to set up a relatively clean company from the beginning. You can be a non-technical founder as long as you understand the problem you're solving. I had been a user basically of my product, or a potential user of my product, for 6 years by the time I started working on it, because I'd been tracking my own carbon footprint in an Excel spreadsheet and talking to people about their environmental habits. So I was in a position that I really understood my user and the problem I was solving, which ended up becoming sort of my core strength that I could hire around. But definitely there's a big learning curve. And I spent quite a bit of time learning through tools like Sprint or Lean Startup, other books and approaches for non-technical people to understand how to prototype and test solutions very quickly without having to build anything in code. And I also learned a lot from our advisors. I think it was really, I couldn't have done it without those advisors in the early days who spent the time teaching me about mobile app architecture and sort of back-end, front-end systems, what types of technologies we should use. There was definitely a lot of learning involved.
Yeah. Can I just interject and ask, these early advisors, who were they? So
one was my co-founder. Another was a person in her lab who was a self-taught engineer who understood, he had taught himself how to code about 5 years before. So he could relate to where I was coming from with not having a lot of background. I actually also took some coding boot camps online. I took Computer Science 101 when I was in college. I took it again when I was in grad school. And then I also downloaded the Grasshopper app because we were building in JavaScript, so I learned JavaScript a little bit. So it did help to be able to, in those early days especially, to be able to do a little bit of code review and sort of see what was being built and understand it myself. And then we had an advisor once we raised our first round from Sequoia, they put us in touch with a very senior engineering leader at Facebook who was very passionate about climate change, who helped our first engineer think through how to build systems for scale, because our first engineer was actually right out of college, and he was a great hacker, but had never built systems that were supposed to scale. So having her, she's still an advisor to us, and we still talk to her, and she still provides sort of career advice to our engineers. So she was a third advisor who was very helpful.
Thank you. There are 2 questions from the audience that are related to pitching to investors. One is, can you give some tips about developing the right pitch to get your desired results? And the second one is, what kind of metrics or financials did investors ask for?
I think so the first time I pitched for angel round, or pre-seed round, once Sequoia came in, it was no longer just angels. I created, I think, over 100 versions of my slide deck over the course of talking to all of these different investors. That was when I was hearing one thing and I'd try to shift my story. And then a few months later, I'd say, no, I need to stick to my guns and I need to do this other story. So I think I didn't I didn't have a ton of conviction. I didn't understand what it took to pitch to investors. And I learned over many iterations what it looked like. So that first time I had maybe 100 versions and I wasn't happy with any of them. The second time I pitched, I had two. And I had one, I pitched it to one investor, I tweaked it a little bit, and then I didn't change it after that. And I think that the big thing I learned with that second round was that what writing out the bullet points for my slide deck before I actually built it was very helpful. And just practicing saying those bullet points to people and getting a bit of feedback on it before you try to put anything into slide form is very helpful. You'll see like Sequoia and others have these sort of like 10 slide decks online that you should consider, you know, the arc of your story fitting to. And I wouldn't interpret it literally that they have to be 10 slides, but understand the key points. Those 10 key points have to be incorporated into the story somehow. So before that second time, I wrote out those 10 points and then I sort of put them together into a narrative that felt natural for me to say. And I practiced saying that a few times to friends or to other investors that I felt safe with. And then once I've had a story that I was hitting those 10 points, I put it in and it felt like natural, then I put it into slides and then I basically didn't have to touch it after that. And those 10 points, I think the biggest ones are, who are you? Why are you the person to build this business? What's the problem you're trying to solve and for whom? How do you know that they have this problem? And how big is the market? How big is the potential for this to be? Those are kind of the only three things they really care about at the earliest stages.
Yeah, so it seems like they don't ask a lot of questions about the financials yet.
Oh, sorry, there certainly are other questions. Like, and I think if you go look up like Sequoia 10 slide deck or something, there's a template. And certainly that's one of the 10 points you have to hit on. There needs to be a slide somewhere, whether it's in the appendix or in the deck itself with a 5-year projections or something. It's just a required, I think the most important reason that is there is to see that you as an entrepreneur can make reasonable assumptions, that you've done enough research and you've grounded your work in research and you can make assumptions about how you're going to build that business. So they're more looking to see your own sort of critical thinking skills than anything else, I think, because no matter what, those financial projections need to fit in a certain VC mindset. Like to make VC economics work, if you're pitching to a venture capitalist, you're going to have to probably hit $100 million in somewhere around 5 years in revenue. So you kind of know the parameters. You need to find some way of building a business that's big enough that it's going to make venture level economics work. But I would say that's not like, that's just sort of a check mark. Like you have to have done it and you have to show that you have a story to tell that's going to get you there. But the most important things they're looking for at the earliest stages are you, the problem, and the market.
I totally I mean, that's what I've also found speaking with a lot of investors, that because at the beginning you really don't know what the projections are, just sort of, imaginary to a large extent. And so they're not as important as, one may think they are. Everything you said is, I mean, you do have to have them, but they're not as crucial as you think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you have to have them. And same with unit economics, you have to have them, but they know you haven't built it yet, or you haven't really built the business side of it yet. So they know they're all guesses.
Yeah.
Yep. Here's one question that other student founders might find relatable. How do you motivate yourself in periods of doubt? And how do you prevent the feeling of being burned out?
Wow, those are two very relevant questions. To motivate myself in times of doubt, one big time of doubt for me was when those first 10 investors all said no. That was about November of 2018. It was a few months after I graduated from my business school program, and I had set myself a deadline of Christmas to raise money, and I realized I wasn't going to hit it. And I thought, wow, if I can't pay myself, is this irresponsible? If I can't convince any investors, is there nothing here? Because if someone else should tell me this is a good idea in order for me to believe it. And it was Thanksgiving the week after. So I went home and I went and spent time with my family, and I got some time to just focus on what was important to me and like sort of think about what I was thankful for. And I'm really grateful that that happened to be Thanksgiving weekend, because centering on why I was doing this allowed me to continue. Like I basically was able to focus and say, okay, I know I'm doing this. I know there's a problem I'm solving. I've talked to hundreds of people, and I know a lot of other people have this problem. I know they're willing to pay for a solution. I'm going to build it. Whether someone gives me money to do it or not, I care enough about this problem, and I know other people have this problem, and that's why I'm doing this. So I think whenever I now feel doubt or feel like things aren't working well, I try to schedule user interviews and use that opportunity to recenter on the problem I'm solving and for whom I'm solving it. And if you've really picked a problem that you're passionate about, I think that always helps me get out of those moments. And sorry, what was the second question again?
Just I think you answered both parts of the question, just the feeling of being burnt out and also in the periods of doubt. How do you motivate yourself?
I do think burnout is an important topic for entrepreneurs. Especially in the Bay Area, I've found there's a real culture, sort of like machoism around working super hard. And it can sometimes feel like, oh, everyone else is working 20-hour days, so I should be working a 20-hour day. And if I'm not, then I'm not moving fast enough. And I still kind of struggle with this because there's always so much to do. As an entrepreneur, you're never going to get through your to-do list in a week. You're always going to make a to-do list, and you're always going to make it like 60% of the way there if you're lucky. So it's hard to give yourself a break because it never ends. But two things I try to keep in mind. One, my uncle is an entrepreneur, and I also ask him for advice a lot. And something he told me is that if you're building a company that's going to last, you have to think of this as a marathon, not a sprint. If you want to burn out, great, your company's going to burn out too. But if you really want to build a company that's like a 10-year company, work like you're working for 10 years. So what can you sustain for 10 years? And that's how you should be working. And that's helped me. And then the second thing is just setting some boundaries for myself. Like if there's some things I know I need to do, or I'm not going to be my best self, I'm not going to be able to do my best work. And being an entrepreneur requires quite a bit of creativity as well. And so you don't want to be so in execution mode all the time that you don't see the opportunities for vision and for evolution. So I've found that just making sure that for me, I need 7 hours of sleep usually, otherwise I'm not super functional. So trying to average at least at 7 hours of sleep, even if any given time you're not getting that. And then trying to make sure you keep time for workouts or walks or time with family, whatever rejuvenates you, set those boundaries for things that are non-negotiables.
Yeah, that's super important. Any other questions, Sierra, or should we stop there and
I have a question.
Okay, conscious of the time. So yeah, go on.
First of all, thank you for doing this. And the question I have is, what is the revenue model of Joro? As a business student, I'm interested to know that.
Right now, our revenue comes from when people decide to purchase offsets through us. So the tracking part of the app is free. You can download the app, you can connect your credit and debit cards, you can see the insights based on your own lifestyle. You can also get access to content. So there's articles and guides and even sustainability challenges in there that will help you lower your footprint. But if you would like to offset the emissions that you can't reduce by, for instance, some of the projects we have allow you to restore forests, support farmers who are using regenerative agriculture techniques to store carbon in soil. We have some seaweed projects storing carbon in kelp. And then we have some really interesting, sort of high technology projects with direct air capture and bio oil, where they're actually capturing carbon and storing it underground. So we do the work to source those projects. We evaluate the projects. We've evaluated 24 projects in the last few months and only picked 6 for inclusion. So we sort of do the quality control and monitoring, and then we curate a portfolio of them for you so you can buy into a basket of projects to maximize your impact. We take a 17% fee for doing that work. So when there is a transaction, the average customer right now is spending about $25 to $30 a month in order to go net zero as a person, to zero out their emissions. And we take a 17% margin on that $25 to $30 a month.
Awesome, that sounds good. By the way, I must say that your app UI is so great.
Oh,
I like
yay.
that.
Thanks. Please, if anyone here downloads the app and uses it, please send us feedback. On the bottom of the homepage, there's a little field that says, do you have any feedback about Joro? Like, please, I would love to hear your initial reactions and thoughts and ideas. I always read those emails, so.
That's great. Sierra, any last questions from the audience? Because then I have last questions for Sanchali. And are you okay ending like 5 minutes later, Sanchali?
Yes, no problem.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a question about building the startup team. In your opinion, how is the ideal startup team composed in relation to individual competencies?
So I think the ideal startup team is built around the founder's core skills. So if you have a founder who is technical, who's say maybe a software developer, then you will probably want to hire the next couple people around the team who have different skills or complementary skills or ways of thinking to the founder. For myself, as someone who is non-technical and very steeped in the problem, I knew that I needed to focus on hiring an engineer who understood more of the execution side of how we were going to build it. So that I mentioned our first hire was someone who's straight out of undergrad. He didn't have a ton of experience in how to scale systems, but that was okay because we were building something just to prove out the early part. And he was very oriented on how do we build this quickly. And that was very helpful for me, someone who's conceptually thinking about the problems we were solving. And actually my second hire was a head of engineering, because we hired another engineer and then we hired a head of engineering. Who had 20 years of experience and knew a lot about scaling systems and building scalable architecture, and also knew a lot about managing teams, large teams, which I didn't know a lot about. So that was super helpful. And we also hired a designer very early because I had no background in design and I knew building a consumer product, the UX and UI experience would be super important. So that's like an example, just using Joro's team as an example of starting to build out, what do you think are the things most important to this experience, and where do you as a founder, you have to know your own skills and weaknesses so that you can hire around that. But I think a characteristic of many people who join early teams is that they are very passionate about the problem you're solving. So in the early days, one way we screen for that is by not paying as much as other companies. And so someone has to be super passionate about joining. Also, we don't have a ton of resources, so it's really hard to compete with other Bay Area companies. But that can only last so long. But in the early days when you're strapped for resources, it's a good screen for people who are really passionate, and being able to give them more equity and maybe less cash. And then also people who don't take no for an answer, like we're really determined, we'll figure it out, and won't get easily disheartened by all the inevitable difficulties you're going to face. Someone who's really collaborative and communicative, because there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of ambiguity and a lot of fast decisions you have to make. So making sure you find people you can communicate well with, and who might have similar communication styles to you, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, that's really, really valuable insights. I agree with everything you said, and really great insights you're sharing with us. Sierra, should I move on? You done with your questions? Any other audience questions? Or
yeah, there are a few more questions, but I think we are at time now. So you should
okay.
ask your final question.
So I wanted to ask, one is like, what's next? What's keeping you up at night now?
Right now, so I mentioned we spent about a year getting our algorithms good enough on to be able to provide good estimates to people on their carbon footprint. For the last 6 months, 8 months, we've been thinking more about the subscription to carbon offsets and being able to demonstrate the business model. And so now we're starting to see some evidence that the subscription model is providing value to our users. We're seeing that customers who subscribe retain. There's very little cancellation. People have pretty high satisfaction with the product. We have some work to do on the sign-up flows, I'm sure. You guys will see if you try to sign up for the subscription. There's certainly places in the user experience we can make it better, so we're working on that. But now we're starting to think about growth. So now that we've proven with a smallish group of users that we're providing something valuable that meets their needs, how do we get more people into the product and continue to improve? Because the more people we get, also the better sense of what we need to make it really work for them. So what's keeping me up at night is thinking about how we're going to grow and what our unique sort of path to market is going to be. We're experimenting with partnerships and influencers and also providing referral marketing. So giving people an incentive to join if they're referred from someone else. So right now, if you subscribe as a Net Zero member, you will get a special referral link where you can invite someone else to get $5 of free carbon credits if they sign up. So we're trying some of these different approaches and experimenting, and that's sort of what's keeping me up at night is how will we grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, that sounds like a really good strategy. And then final question. What advice do you have for the aspiring entrepreneurs in the audience? What do you wish, you would
Two
think?
pieces of advice. One is that you as a person, like whatever your unique life experience is, have some company that only you can build and that no one else can. And I think that's really important because often people think, oh, I'm not smart enough. I definitely thought that when I was starting as a founder. I'm not a computer scientist. Like, I don't know how to build an app. I don't know so many things. How can I build this company? But I think the reality is I have a unique perspective I've had a unique set of experiences in my life that's allowed me to see the problem I'm solving and connect with people who need this problem solved and help to build a solution for them. And each of us has that for maybe multiple problems that we could be helping to solve. So don't doubt yourself. Like if you find something that you're passionate about and you think you have a hunch that maybe you could build something that helps people in that space, try to like bolster that in yourself and be around people who help you feel confident. And then 2 is just perseverance is a huge part of success. If you're willing to stick to something, you will probably beat other people at it because it's very easy to drop out. It's really hard to start a company. And I wouldn't be too shy about sharing your ideas with others either. I think in the early days, people can be worried about sharing their ideas because, oh, what if someone else takes my idea? 99% of the time, no one's going to take your idea because no one's going to have like the endurance to actually start it. So if you can stick with it, if you find something you care enough about to stick with, I think like 90% of people who succeed are mostly just like, there's lots of other people who think of those same ideas like DoorDash or Fitbit. Like how many people in the world have thought that would be a good company to build, but only a few people went and built it. And so yeah, just stick with it.
Exactly. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much. I couldn't have said it better. So it was so insightful, and you shared so many, great tips with us and your experience. And I'm really grateful you could join us, and I know you are. So thank you so much, and wish you all the very best, Sanchali. I want to see you grow and be really successful. And I hope that the students in the audience will download the app and hope give you feedback one way or the other. And thank you so much. And to everyone who's joined us, thank you for joining. We have another session. Our next session is on November 8th. And we have, in fact, we have Regis McKenna, the well-known marketing guru who advised Steve Jobs, coming to speak to us. So that's on November 8th. And if you have a good idea, please apply to the Zin Starter program. Varenya is here, connect with him and apply, and you could get a small amount of funding to start your startup. So Sanchali, thank you very much for joining us. And Sierra and Varenya, thank you for joining, and to everyone in the audience.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. And students, VLab students, I'll see you in 20 minutes. Bye.